All right, so this time I'm going to talk about the liver and supporting the liver and about a couple of herbs that are used in that process. So the liver is a really interesting uh, human organ. It's really the largest internal organ, at least the largest solid internal organ. The intestines take up more space, but they're hollow. And don't contain as much actual tissue. So the liver, the large, you've probably seen pictures of the liver. It's vaguely wedge shaped. The wide end of it is on the right side of the body, just under the diaphragm, the upper right quadrant of the abdomen, although it reaches most of the way across the abdomen. And the liver has a lot of different functions, and it's not for a lot of things we would kind of more clearly have an idea of what system a different an organ goes in, like this saying that the brain is part of the nervous system or the heart's part of the cardiovascular system. The liver is kind of part of, I guess people would say it's part of the digestive system, but it's also part of the circulatory system, and it's also part of the endocrine system. So it has a lot of functions. It makes a lot of different substances. It's mostly something people think of as having two main sets of functions, which is filtering the blood and producing bile, producing some of the digestive juices that go into the digestive system from the liver. And so it does indeed do those things, but it also does a lot of other things. And what it does to the blood, describing it as filtration is a huge oversimplification, because it's not just filtering it, it's modifying it, it's taking stuff out and adding stuff to it. So there's a lot going on there. And I will talk a little bit about that lot of stuff going on there. Obviously this is a subject that books could be and have been written about. And I'm just going to sum up some basics over the course of an hour or so about how the liver works. Now, a lot of the time, the liver is a very vital organ. The name liver kind of implies that it's the thing that does the living, right? Like it's the seat of life in your body. And that's how some ancient people thought of it. Apparently the ancient English-speaking people, as well as the ancient Greeks and some other people, associated it with different emotions and so forth. Like in the humoral system, where you have the four humors, the liver produces bile. Bile is one of the four humors. And it was associated with certain types of feelings and various different alchemical associations that I'm not so familiar with, because that's not my my paradigm that I'm working from. But it was thought of as having a lot to doing a lot in the body besides being a digestive substance. It's being one of the four primary fluids in the body. And we also might talk of someone having a lot of gall, meaning that they have courage or audacity or something like that. And that's also the same thing. That's like another word for bile. It's the same liquid. So it had a lot of associations with strong emotions. And the liver does actually, as it turns out, play some role in emotions and in how people feel mentally as well as physically. So all the blood that's coming from the stomach and the small intestine is going to go through the liver. It's going to circulate through the liver. So it's in those areas and it's absorbing nutrients. And then from there, it's going to go through the liver before it goes through the rest of the body. And in so doing, the liver filters the blood. It takes out waste products, and it also breaks down nutrients with enzymes. The liver produces a lot of enzymes which can change amino acids. Hopefully, when something is getting absorbed into the bloodstream, if you eat protein, then your digestive system is meant to break that protein down into individual amino acids, which are the building blocks that protein are made out of. Each protein is a long string of simple amino acids, and there's a limited number of amino acids that are common in proteins. And so if you absorb protein directly into your bloodstream, your immune system is going to recognize it as a foreign substance and start an inflammatory response against it. And that's bad. So instead of having that happen, the idea is that it all gets broken down into the amino acids, which are no different in you than they are in other animals. They're not individual recognizable proteins. They're just very universal building blocks. And those are going to get absorbed into the bloodstream. So it doesn't always work exactly like that, but that's the way that it works when things are going well. And so that stuff gets taken into the liver. And the liver can change those amino acids into other amino acids, which are the building blocks of some hormones as well, because some of our hormones are actually proteins. And some of them are other things. Some of them are steroids. And most of the steroidal ones are made from cholesterol, which the liver produces also using fat. So the liver will take fat and it will convert it into cholesterol. And that cholesterol will go, for example, to the ovaries and get turned into estrogen, or go to the adrenal cortex and get turned into testosterone, or that can also happen in various different places in the body. But there are a lot of these different steroidal hormones that are produced in different glands in the body, and the glands are working on cholesterol, which is the framework for them, and that's made in the liver. So the liver plays a huge role in the endocrine system, like a very foundational role in the endocrine system, so that if your liver isn't healthy, hang on just a second. Okay, so if your liver isn't healthy, it's basically impossible for your endocrine system to be healthy, since it is providing a lot of the raw materials that your endocrine system is using. Similarly, other nutrients are being processed through the liver or synthesized in the liver. Vitamin D can be partly synthesized in the liver, for instance. So that's another role that it plays, is synthesizing some nutrients. It also is going to break down certain drugs, certain toxic substances into other substances that your body can either use or can get rid of. So a lot of the time, if someone takes a medicine, the medicine will change form as it's passing through the liver and become a different substance that is maybe no longer functional, or maybe has a different function. So, for instance, if someone drinks alcohol, of course, that passes through the liver, and that can cause, an inflammatory reaction. It can cause damage to the liver. It can overwork the liver. But the liver is going to produce enzymes that are going to turn ethanol into acetaldehyde, which is a different substance. And then that acetaldehyde is going to pass through again, and it's going to get transformed into some harmless things like water and carbon dioxide. And so it's a two-step process, but it does, detoxify the substance from the body, from the bloodstream, and help to get it out. The things that are broken down might be referred to as metabolites, things that have been metabolized. So plays a huge role in all of that, both in helping medicines work in your body, keeping poisons from destroying you as easily, and another role that it plays in the endocrine and nutritive system is that it creates a substance called glycogen. And glycogen is a starch. It's a carbohydrate that is stored in the human body, in the liver, and in other places as well. And it's basically a way that your body can store energy in chemical form for short-term use. So fat, we all know, is how calories kind of tend to end up if your body's storing a lot of extra calories, or that's, you know, what everybody thinks of. But there's also this other substance, glycogen. Fat takes a while to break down. Glycogen can break down right away. If your body produces some adrenaline, then glycogen starts getting released and turned into glucose, which gives you an immediately usable form of energy. So the liver has a role in creating this short-term storage of energy, and that's really important. When somebody gets exhausted, somebody's chronically sleep deprived, the glycogen is going to get depleted, and it's going to affect someone's liver because it's going to be trying to produce more of the glycogen, which it can really not do easily if you're not getting adequate sleep. So glycogen is Glycogen. Glyco meaning sugar and gen meaning creator. So it's something that produces sugar, creates sugar in the body. Let's see. So those are some of the big things that the liver does. Another thing that it does is that it breaks down used cells, especially red blood cells. The hemoglobin in the cells gets broken down into a substance called bilirubin, which is sort of a brownish substance. Part of what, well, it's part of the chemical pathway, or part of the process that gives human stools and most other vertebrate animals stools brown color. So if that part of the process isn't happening, people will have pale colored stools, look really weird. And that's something that would be a sign that the liver is doing badly. Also, you know, one of the most common visible things that people are aware of to look for with the liver being overtaxed or functioning insufficiently for its circumstances is jaundice, which is just kind of a buildup of the same type of stuff in your bloodstream. And that means that your body is, your liver's producing too much of its substances because it's working too hard, or it's having a hard time keeping up with the burden of breaking down cells and kind of recycling the substances that they contain. So when someone's liver is weak, be it from hepatitis, which is an infection, well, it's not always an infection. So if somebody has hepatitis, that is an infection that can cause them to be yellowish. If they drink a lot, that can cause it to. Various other physical damage to the liver can cause it. Or if someone has certain viral illnesses like mono that kill off a lot of red blood cells, or maybe malaria, yellow fever, things like that. If a lot of the red cells are dying off, the person can become jaundiced just because the liver is having a hard time keeping up with the amount of hemoglobin it's having to break down. So yellowish skin, yellow coloring to the eyes, yellow coating on the tongue can all be signs that the liver is having a hard time. It's often accompanied by abdominal pain, and sometimes, especially when things are really bad, it's accompanied by a couple other symptoms, one of which is the liver feeling hard. Like you impress on someone's abdomen, and instead of it feeling soft and squishy, it feels like there's a hard, I don't know, something with the consistency of wood or something like that under their skin. It doesn't feel the way that a person's abdomen is supposed to feel, and it's where the liver is located. So that's one thing. Another thing is swelling of the abdomen, a distended abdomen, and fluid retention in the abdomen. Sometimes you can press on someone's side and hear like a swishing sound, like a sloshing of liquid. That means that they're pretty far gone. That can also be accompanied by fluid retention in the arms and legs. So these are all things that would be really bad signs that the liver is doing badly. A lot of the time, somebody's liver can be doing less than perfectly, and there won't be anything that drastically physically visible. Fatigue, even though it's a very non-specific finding, obviously, that goes with lots of things and has to do with a lot of different things that can go wrong. But fatigue very frequently involves the liver, very frequently involves the liver being depleted and not able to build up the store of glycogen like I'm talking about. So that's something to be aware of. If someone's chronically fatigued, sometimes supporting their liver can be really helpful. And if somebody is recovering from or has been doing a lot of indulging in alcohol or certain other substances that can have a strong bad effect on the liver, even something like Tylenol, paracetamol, if somebody's doing a lot of it or doing it daily over a long period of time, it can put quite a strain on the liver. And so people might not realize that that's a potential problem. And I've seen that sort of thing a lot, where someone's maybe taking that because of pain, and then they're feeling fatigued all the time, and they feel like the fatigue is just a result of the fact that they're in pain, they're not sleeping, things like that. And it's that too, but a lot of the time, if you can remove the insult to the liver and use something else for managing the pain, sometimes the energy will get a lot better. So that's a very common scenario to see in people who are not extremely ill, but have been somewhat unwell for quite a while. Let's see. So. Question: if somebody has high cholesterol, can that be a malfunction of the liver? And if so, what herbs could balance that out? That is probably one of the reasons that people get high cholesterol. And liver supporting herbs often do help with that. Sometimes there are a lot of different liver supporting herbs that I use, but sometimes just using gentle liver supporting herbs, like probably the thing I use the most often in somebody who has been found to have high cholesterol but doesn't have any particular symptoms that would, be related to that. It's just a finding on a blood test. A lot of the time I will use turmeric, which is an anti-inflammatory and very mildly liver supporting herb that is helpful in a very gentle way for a wide variety of things. And 6 months or a year later, those numbers are often lower or back where they're supposed to be. So it's whether the cholesterol is a response to inflammation and it's bringing down the inflammation, or whether the cholesterol is a response to the liver being taxed and it's helping the liver, I'm not exactly sure. Maybe both in some cases, or maybe it's usually both together. But it usually seems to help. So there's a really long tradition in many traditional medical systems in the world of using support for the liver as sort of a remedy that you might use when you don't know what else is going on, or a remedy that you might use when you or that you might just use very frequently for less specific things. Like if somebody's been sick for a long time, there's a good chance that because the liver has so many roles that it's been overtaxed by the long sickness. So using an herb that supports the liver is often something that's helpful for that. Sometimes this is referred to as purifying the blood, or cleansing, which cleansing is a very broad term, but cleansing the liver. And it's not literally exactly that. It's not like you have necessarily a lot of accumulated stuff in your liver that's being removed. It's really more like the liver's overtaxed and you're helping it out. Although there are waste products that do accumulate in the liver, and there are things that could be thought of as literally cleansing, but there's more to it than that. There's more to it than that. It's about rejuvenating and nourishing the liver rather than just trying to purge it. At least when I do it, it is. There are many different approaches to this, and some of them are more severe than others. But for example, where I'm from, sassafras is something that a lot of people use once a year or so as a blood purifying tonic. And so sassafras is either the roots or the bark of a sassafras tree, which is usually a small tree. It has a very aromatic taste to it. You boil the roots. The traditional use for it as a blood tonic would be to take it in the third week of February. So like around Valentine's Day, as a tea. And so at that time of year, you would want to use the roots. Well, not necessarily. You could use the roots or the bark. In the winter, you'd want to use the roots. The sap starts flowing again somewhere around that time of year, and at that point, the bark peels off really easily, and you can use the bark pretty easily. So this is a tea, and it has some, effects on the liver. It's sort of purifying, nurturing, gets juices flowing through the liver, helps with the circulation, brings down inflammation, things like that. It was a very popular remedy and commercial product at one point in time, but in the 70s, the FDA banned it because of animal studies showing that it caused tumors in rats. And they later identified the metabolite, the breakdown product of safrole. Safrole is one of the ingredients, one of the chemical constituents in sassafras. They later identified the metabolite of that responsible for causing the tumors as being something that's not actually produced in humans, or doesn't appear to be produced in humans. And there'd already been a long tradition of using sassafras to repel rodents. We knew that they couldn't really tolerate it so well. So it's not surprising that they didn't do well with it in the laboratory study, but it remains pretty much something that's difficult to buy because it's not really considered appropriate for human consumption by the US government. You can get sassafras extracts, but they have to take the safrole out, which kind of makes them not taste like sassafras and maybe not have all the medicinal properties anymore either. When people do take sassafras, it often leads to a kind of a general feeling of elation, well-being, sometimes increased libido, sometimes increased energy. And it generally just kind of makes people feel good, but it's a soothing, liver supporting herb that I consider a pretty gentle remedy. And I do make tea out of it, and sometimes I make root beer out of it, and various other things like that. So that would be one example of a way that people would take a tonic for the liver. Another more dramatic example would be to take a very bitter herb that would induce diarrhea by causing the liver to produce lots of bile, dump lots of bile into the digestive system, and that kind of runs through somebody and comes out as usually greenish kind of diarrhea. And I question the utility of that for the most part. There might be times when it's helpful, but I think it's kind of something where dramatic effect has kind of made it more popular than actual clinical outcomes would have made it. So I'm not a huge fan of the intense scouring cleanses, although in the traditional medicine in the community I grew up in, they were pretty common. So people might use golden seal or yellow root for that particular particular application, or Culver's root, which is another plant that has a extremely bitter root that works that way, or even aloe, the latex from aloe leaves, which is very intensely bitter yellowish latex from certain varieties of aloe that can have that same effect. And we could call these cholagogues. Cholagogues meaning that they cause movement of bile from the liver into the digestive system. So they tend to act as laxatives. They also do increase the amount of filtration that's going on in the liver, but they're not necessarily more purifying or more cleansing than some of the gentle methods. They're just kind of more outwardly dramatic. And they also are more depleting, which if somebody's been sick for a while and they're low energy and stuff, you don't want to do a dramatic depleting type of treatment. It will usually, it runs the risk of further depleting them, which is not what you want to have happen. So the composition of the liver, it's got a lot of blood vessels in it, and then the parts that aren't blood vessels are mostly a particular type of tissue, or tissue made of a particular type of cell called hepatocytes. And so, you know, if you've ever handled liver, like, or eaten liver, or, you know, butchered an animal or something like that, you probably are familiar with what liver tissue is like. That's mostly hepatocytes. And hepatocytes have an amazing regenerative capacity. If someone's liver gets badly damaged, even if 2/3 or so of someone's liver is cut out, the liver can regenerate tissue and compensate for that. It won't really regain its original structure because the liver has like a 3-lobe structure. It has different sections. And if one of those sections was gone, it would just be like the other sections growing to kind of fill the space and make up for it, rather than regenerating that section. But as far as the amount of tissue, your body will tend towards having a certain amount of liver tissue, and will make more if it gets destroyed. And this is, you know, this is something that's famously referenced in the story of the Greek myth of Prometheus. Prometheus was one of the Titans who were sort of like the old gods before the gods of Olympus came around, sort of primordial forces personified as giants. And one of them, Prometheus, stole fire from the gods of Olympus and gave it to humans. And that made the difference between humans being, you know, basically a different kind of animal, and being able to become a technological species and maybe rival the gods of Olympus in their ability to do stuff. And so the gods of Olympus were really mad at Prometheus for this. They chained him to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains and let a bird come and eat his liver every so often, and his liver would grow back. So, you know, at least in this legend, there's some reference to the liver having regenerative properties. So apparently the ancient Greeks were aware that that was a thing that could happen, seemingly, probably because of people sustaining damage in battles and things like that. And then, you know, being able to palpate the person's liver after it had been damaged and realize that it had grown back and filled the space it was supposed to be in. So we've known for a long time that the liver could do this. It's really not the case with any other organ in the body. You know, if part of one of your lungs gets destroyed or removed, it's not going to grow back. You know, one of your eyes gets destroyed, poked out, you're not going to grow a new one, but you can grow more liver tissue. So it's fairly unique in having that kind of. The skin, of course, is also regenerative, and the skin is another very large organ like the liver, but not really any other internal organ that I can think of would have that kind of regenerative capacity. And so if somebody's liver is damaged through, not just through, being cut out or being eaten by a mythical bird or anything like that, but just maybe from, years of alcohol abuse, for instance, or from a bad case of hepatitis, it is possible with the right support for the liver, if you bring down the inflammation, if you give it the nutrients it needs and so forth, for it to regenerate tissue. And for somebody who looks like they're in a state where they're not much, don't have much time left in the world, to get back to being much healthier and having their liver functioning pretty well, if you can manage to stop whatever process is causing the damage, or if that process is self-limiting. So it's an amazing organ for its ability to heal itself and its ability to heal the rest of the body as well. When you're working with the liver, so I've talked some about some of the problems that people have when their liver is not working, right? The fatigue, the jaundice, the abdominal pain, fluid retention. When you start getting the liver working, sometimes you see some issues arise as a result of that as well, depending on how bad it is, and also depending on what kind of remedies you're using. You might see some nausea, although there shouldn't be much of that, and it should be short-lived. It's very normal to see a strong increase in frequency of bowel movements and in the looseness of bowel movements. That's something that, you, like I said before, you have to manage for that when it's happening. That's an area where supportive care is required, and you have to make sure it's not dehydrating the person. But that is something that you might see. Also, I'm not exactly sure why, but a lot of the time when people are working on their liver, sometimes strong emotions come up, rage, sometimes sadness, things like that can come up. I think that it's probably partly fluctuations in hormones from what the liver is doing, probably also partly how the liver is interacting with the large amount of nervous system tissue in the abdomen. So that's something to be aware of, to not be surprised if it happens. If you're trying to help somebody who's recovering from an illness and you're supporting their liver, and all of a sudden they're, really angry without a lot of explanation for why. Sometimes that's just part of the process. Sometimes it's something that comes up, not necessarily saying that you should take a lot of flack from them or whatever, but realize that it might just be, a transient thing that is a result of working on sort of stuck energy or stuck movement of important messaging substances in the body. Yeah. So some ways that we can work on the liver, some very general strategies for working on the liver. If the liver is very irritated, it's a good idea to avoid rich foods, fatty foods, very sweet foods, or even very large meals. Any of those things can exacerbate liver pain, liver inflammation, something like that. So, you want to kind of have a more of a bland diet, more small meals rather than fewer large ones. You probably don't want to have a lot of digestion going on while the person is asleep. So not taking late meals, is a good idea, for all other things being equal. Now there might be certain times when the person is just really hungry and they need to be able to eat to be able to feel calm, or to feel like they can rest. And you have to work around things like that the best you can. But realize that having that digestion going on in the nighttime while they're sleeping might keep the liver from doing certain other things as well, from regenerating in particular. So obviously avoiding anything that's damaging to it, like alcohol, can be really important. A lot of the time, if somebody's really, most of the extracts that I use have some alcohol in them. Sometimes I even use liver supporting herbs that are in an alcohol base, although that's not necessarily ideal. It is convenient sometimes, but if somebody has a severely impacted liver, which in my practice, when I'm usually seeing that, it's somebody who's been overindulging in alcohol and is trying to get themselves straightened out, get their physiology back into a better condition after they've made the decision not to do that anymore. So in those cases, I really just try and strictly avoid it, strictly avoid giving them even medicine that would have it in it, have the taste of it, or anything like that. So some bitter herbs, mild bitter herbs, usually not something that's severe enough that it's going to cause diarrhea. I don't really like to do it that way, but some bitterness, the taste of bitterness sort of helps the liver to work, or signals to the liver to release bile. So that's something. Heat on the area, like a hot compress or a hot castor oil pack over the liver, can be a helpful thing. Sometimes when the liver becomes swollen, because it's got a lot of blood vessels through it, when it's inflamed, those blood vessels don't always go where they need to go. Sometimes they're kind of squished closed or squeezed in a way that blood can't flow through them, or bile can't flow through the bile ducts the way that it would normally be able to. So if there can be both depositions of fat, which come from long-term inflammation, there can be scarring, and there can be swelling, and all of those things can decrease the circulation in the liver. And heat, and especially I like warm castor oil packs, or warm lamb's wool soaked in warm castor oil, as a topical application over the liver and over the floating rib at the base of the liver. All of those things can kind of help soothe, like just physically soothe the liver, and increase the perfusion, increase the movement of fluid through those small blood vessels. And that can really be relieving and helpful. Often if somebody has a lot of fluid retention, if they have a lot of abdominal pain, that will actually make a very noticeable symptomatic difference. There are a few, Aaron asks, why castor oil? So it doesn't have to be castor oil. The warmth matters more than anything. It doesn't have to be lamb's wool either, but castor oil is kind of mildly stimulating or irritating to the skin, in a way that makes it feel warm on the skin, even when it's actually at room temperature. So that's a reason why you would use it. You might think you could use the cayenne salve for the same thing, or you could just use something that was just a hot wet towel, something like that. They all work. They all have their ways of working. Castor oil is something that's fairly traditional for that application, that I've tried and liked the results of, and that's really the main reason, is that I tried it because somebody told me to, and I liked how it turned out. But it's not. It doesn't have to be castor oil if that's not the most available thing to you. The cayenne salve would obviously be like a more intense version of that, because it would be hotter. But castor oil does have a sort of a warming effect on the skin. And it's also thick. It sticks around for a while. It stays around for a while. Continues having that effect for a while. Yeah, flannel is another thing that people have often used instead of the lamb's wool, and that works really well too, and might be, you know, more readily available. Uh, but it's, you know, the point is to have something warming over the liver to help with the movement of blood vessels. I also use moxibustion, which is you know, just heat from burning mugwort uh, held over the area, and especially over the next to last rib on the right side, and that tends to get things moving in that area as well. So there are some soothing type herbs like prickly pear and milk thistle that you can make a decoction of. Marshmallow is like this as well, but less so. And these things are kind of protective and soothing to the liver from the digestive system side. And milk thistle especially is something that seems to have a pretty strong protective effect on the liver. There are also a few aromatic herbs like rosemary and sage that can help the liver through the bloodstream. And they're just kind of, well, they're sort of cooling and sort of warming, but they contain certain essential oils that are in the plant material, that are in the decoction, if you make a decoction of it, that are helpful to soothing the liver and decreasing inflammation in it. Like I said before, turmeric, which is an anti-inflammatory, is helpful in that regard. Anti-inflammatories in general might be helpful, although you don't really want to use ones that are hard on the liver. So the more bitter ones might be helpful if the liver isn't in too bad of a shape. If you try to do something really stimulating to the liver while it's in really bad shape, it's just going to hurt. It's going to be like kind of like you know, well, it's already exhausted and you're trying to flog it and get it to do more work. So in less bad situations, a bitter anti-inflammatory herb could be helpful. In more severe situations, you would want to use something that was not very strong in that direction. How would you use prickly pear? So when I use prickly pear, I make a decoction of the pads, the flat part, flat stem sections of prickly pear. And it produces a sort of a slimy substance, contains some polysaccharides, some special starches that maybe absorb bile acids. And I'm not sure what all else it does, but it seems to have some effect that's helpful there. It is a little bit bitter as well. So yeah, that's something that I use. So one of the herbs that I want to talk about kind of leads right into this situation, and that's burdock, burdock root. Burdock is a really common weed around here. There's actually two species of it. One's bigger and one's smaller. The bigger one is more common. So burdock has a round taproot that looks kind of like a white carrot, although it can be really deep. I've dug up one that was a few feet long before. They're often around a foot long. It's a starchy root. It can be cooked and eaten like a vegetable. If you're making medicine out of it, you basically want to chop it up and boil it and use the liquid, which is bitter and also contains some starches, also contains some aromatic compounds. It has a very gentle, it's food, you know, it's like a medicinal food basically. So if you boil it and you take the roots out and mash them up or crush them up or chop them up, they're just like a soft vegetable type of thing. they have their own unique earthy tastes to them, but they're basically a root vegetable. And the water that you boil them in is the medicine. That's the more strong part. There's a little bit of the medicine still in the vegetable, of course, but most of the medicine is coming out into the water that they're cooked in. You want to make sure you wash the mud off first, right? But it's a really good remedy for the liver, because it's something you could really take every day for the rest of your life and it wouldn't cause you any harm, probably. So it's very gentle and it's very versatile. If somebody's liver is having a hard time and you don't know why, it's usually going to be strong enough to help them move towards healing over a fairly short period of time. And it's going to be gentle enough that it's not going to provoke a crisis. For example, if somebody's got a really congested liver and you give them a really strong liver cleansing thing, it might help, but it might cause a lot of pain and a lot of diarrhea and vomiting and things like that along the way. Burdock will almost never do that, and it will almost always help eventually if you keep giving it to them. So it's a really good one to know for working on the liver. You can also make other forms out of burdock. You can make tinctures out of it and things too, but a decoction is really nice for being non-alcoholic. You can make a vinegar extract of it as well, but it's can be kind of a hassle to dig up. There is a cultivated variety that you can often find in Asian food stores, Korean food stores, or Japanese food stores. So that's a less labor intensive way to get it than actually digging it yourself. Although it's a really common plant. If you have a field and then some woods at the edge of the field, you'll often find a large stand of burdock growing where the two meet. It starts leafing out in late winter, and the leaves get really big. They can be a couple feet long and almost a foot wide. They're really one of the larger leaves of an herbaceous plant around here. Usually it'll do a year or so with just leaves, and then it'll put up a flowering stalk, and the fruit is a burr. It's like a little tiny ball of hooks, and the hooks attached to dog hair and horse manes and people's clothes and other animal fur too, and that's how they get around. It's not native to this area. It was brought over here probably attached to the fur of people's horses, although people may have brought it over here to cultivate it on purpose as a food as well. Europeans used to eat it all the time, but it has become a fairly rare thing in the traditional foods from that part of the world. But it is edible and it is pretty decent, although some people don't like it because it tastes kind of like dirt. It has an earthy flavor to it. I think it tastes kind of good, but it is somewhat reminiscent of, it tastes the way that the ground smells after a light rain, which is actually some substances that are produced by soil organisms that are getting accumulated in the burdock. But that's what it tastes like, which I find interesting and pleasant, but some people find it disagreeable. So it's a really good one to know about. You can make a fermented drink out of dandelion leaf and burdock root, or dandelion leaf and root, which are more bitter, and burdock root chopped up together, and then maybe have something sweet added to it like honey or sugar, and a little bit of yeast, and allow that to ferment basically overnight, and then bottle it and refrigerate it. You get a fizzy drink that is very edifying to the liver. And this was a popular beverage that was promoted by the temperance movement in the 1800s, early 1900s. These were people that wanted everybody to stop drinking alcohol, and tried, and in some cases succeeded in outlawing the sale of alcohol. But their idea behind this was that it was something that would be good for your liver instead of bad for your liver, maybe undo some of the damage that that drinking alcohol did. But if you wanted to have a foamy, bad tasting beverage like everybody else, you could still have one without having beer. So that's something that was a very popular beverage and is still around. There are still commercial versions of dandelion and burdock beverages that are sold, but they were really popular at one point. And it's a fun thing to make because it doesn't take very long. It's something you can home brew, and it takes basically overnight or around 24 hours instead of weeks. And it doesn't have any meaningful amount of alcohol in it, just a lot of fizz. So you could make it alcoholic if you let it ferment longer before you bottled it and chilled it, but that's kind of defeating the purpose. So is it similar to kombucha? It's not very similar to kombucha. I mean, you could make a kombucha version of it too, but the kombucha, you'd ferment kombucha longer, and it would be making it more sour. It would be producing lactic acid, some acetic acid as it was fermenting, instead of just producing carbon dioxide in a very short fermentation cycle, which probably also produces some acetic acid and maybe some alcohol too, but not enough because you're only doing it for 24 hours, not enough for it to be noticeable. So it's I don't know. It's a lot like root beer or ginger ale or something like that if you wanted to make it the old-fashioned way without seltzer water. But it's fun. It's fun project to make. Maybe I'll stick a recipe in the comment section if I remember to. But burdock in general is a really good liver herb that's very gentle. Dandelion root is also pretty good liver herb. It's a bit stronger than burdock is. Chicory is slightly stronger than dandelion. Chicory leaf is about on the same order as dandelion. So these are all very common weeds that are mild but effective support and stimulation for the liver. Now, milk thistle is kind of, which I mentioned before, it's not really stimulating to the liver as much as it is protective of it. It might stimulate it a little bit, but mostly it's protective of it. Burdock is a little more protective and stimulating, but very gently. So it's something that I consider safe enough to use for somebody with a very depleted liver or a very depleted system, but strong enough that it often really makes a big difference. So it's a great one to know when you're just getting started, because you can help people without running the risk of harming them. The thing about burdock, if you are harvesting it, it likes to grow in disturbed ground. And if you can find very disturbed ground, like a place where dirt's been piled up from construction or something like that, then the ground might be really loose. Or if it's an old field that's been plowed 1.5 feet deep, you might be able to dig it out really easily if it's something that's been plowed but not planted in the last year or two. You don't want to really gather it once it's started sending up a stem. You want to gather it when it's just the big leaves, because once it's starting sending up a stem, all the energy in the roots and all the substances in the roots are going to go towards that reproductive process, towards making the leaf and the flower and the fruit on the stem. And so the best time to harvest it is right before it starts to do that, when it's had a long time to build up the root, but hasn't started spending the energy in the root, hasn't started using the substances in the root for something else yet. So often that's early spring in the second year of its growth. So that's the ideal time to harvest it. I went and dug some up the last week in March this year. And I just kind of dug a ditch along the edge of a field, where there was a whole row of it growing, and gathered about 5 pounds of it in a relatively short amount of time. And you can dry burdock root. It dries very nicely. You don't have to cut it up into small pieces or anything. You can dry it as a whole root. It dries out pretty quickly. It has little air spaces inside the root, so it tends to dry really well and not to kind of mold or anything like that as it's drying. I usually cut it into sections about 4 to 6 inches long, just because it's easier to handle them than having them be really long, and let those dry out. Let's see. I don't really harvest any part of the burdock root, burdock plant, other than the root. The leaves are somewhat poisonous. They're just kind of they contain a lot of oxalic acids and similar substances that are going to be hard on the kidneys if you consume them. So I don't use them for anything. They do have some topical uses as medicines, but I don't really use them for anything myself. The dried root will last about a year or so. I haven't tried keeping it longer than that, but it will definitely last until next year when it's time to harvest it again. And you don't have to harvest it in the spring. That's not the only time it can be harvested. You can find large burdock plants with large leaves and no stem most of the year, but that's my preferred time to harvest it. I find that that's when you can find the most big, deep roots from any one stand of burdock. So that's when I like to harvest it. And I find it easier to go out and harvest it all. Do one burdock harvest for the year than doing it multiple times. Although if you aren't sure that you're going to be using it very much, maybe you just want to go get one burdock root, and then maybe you'll go get another one later when you need that. Is it used as a powder? I don't use it as a powder. It is used as a powder. I mean, there are burdock powder capsules out there. I like to use it as a decoction because I don't really like to use roots as powders most of the time, because roots are tough. And when you powder them, it's little tiny bits of tough stuff. And it might not get absorbed into the system as easily as if you make it into a decoction and it's already in liquid form, because your body's going to have to extract the substances out of that root material and into a liquid form before it can get into your system anyway. So yeah, I like to, it can be used as a powder. I like to use it as a decoction, where the roots have basically been cooked until they're soft in water, and then I use the water as the medicine, or as the basis for the medicine. So yeah, but definitely it can be used in a lot of different ways. You can even steam the root and eat that, and it'll be kind of a medicinal food. It'll still, if you steam it rather than boiling it, a lot of the stuff will stay in the root. So that's yeah, a good one to know about, just because it's gives you the opportunity to do some good without the risk of doing harm so much. So let's see. The other herb that I wanted to talk to you about is horehound. Horehound is a member of the mint family. It's kind of fuzzy, and it has deep veins in the leaves that you can see really easily that give it a sort of a distinctive appearance. the hor part means white because it's covered in like a white fuzzy down, and then the hound part, I'm not exactly sure why, but I have some ideas that I'll get into in a minute. Its Latin name is marubium. The maru part probably comes from a Middle Eastern word meaning bitter. So it's a very bitter herb. It's a I would say it's one of the more bitter plants that people tend to use medicinally. It has a very green, very vegetable-y flavor to it, but it's intensely bitter. But it's not a poisonous tasting bitter, and that's kind of it's hard for me to explain what that means exactly, but it doesn't taste poisonous. It tastes like just a really bitter vegetable. Some bitter plants taste poisonous. They taste like an acrid and bitter flavor that just kind of, when you taste it, you're like, oh no, this isn't something I should eat. Your system knows not to. Horehound, some people feel like this is really something they shouldn't eat. I don't get that sense from it at all. I really like the way it tastes, even though it's bitter to me. Yeah, the horehound candies are a common, they're a staple of Kentucky confectionery, and they're medicinal as well. They're basically used like cough drops. A lot of cough drops, Ricola cough drops, and some other commercial cough drops contain horehound. So a couple years ago, the American Herbal Products Association said that horehound was actually the most widely used herbal remedy in the United States in terms of the number of units of medicine sold. So people were buying more doses of horehound than any other medicinal herb, mostly in the form of some popular commercial brands of cough drops. So that's one of the things, and probably in modern times, the most widely known thing that horehound is used for is as a cough remedy. And it tends to be soothing and somewhat cough suppressant, but not really as strongly suppressant as cherry, and not really, it's somewhat expectorant. So it does actually help break up congestion and dry up congestion. And then it also makes coughing hurt less. And so it's a really good remedy for that. And of course, if you have it in the form of a horehound candy or a cough drop type of thing, the sugar and the action of sucking on it and swallowing the juice over and over, that's actually soothing to the throat. And that's going to alleviate one of the major discomforts of having a cough. So it's got some anti-inflammatory properties, and it's got some properties for the respiratory system, and it's also nutritive. It contains the same kinds of nutrients you'd find in a lot of other green leafy vegetables, but it's intensely bitter. So as a bitter herb, it is also stimulating to the liver. And if you take, say, a big cup of horehound tea, it can actually have a pretty strong effect on getting bile moving, making the bowels move by making the liver release fluid. It's a question of how many varieties of horehound are there, and do they all have similar medicinal effects? So most of what people call horehound is herb Marubium vulgare, and that's there may be different like cultivated varieties of it, but those all would have the same effect. There is another plant that's called black horehound, and that is a separate plant with separate medicinal effects. And its Latin name is balota, and balota is actually probably started out as an imitation of the sound of vomiting. because that's what it does. It actually is bitter enough and strong enough that it causes people to purge somewhat drastically. And it's much more bitter than regular horehound. So I'm not really talking about that, or when I talk about horehound, mostly just talking about the marubium, which they're all the same kind. There might be different garden strains of it or whatever, because it is a cultivated crop. It's not native here, and you don't usually find it growing in the wild, but occasionally it will persist around an old home site or something like that, where it's escaped from cultivation, like other mints do. But it was brought over here fairly early in the course of people from Europe coming to this continent, and has been grown here ever since. And mostly has been grown by people rather than growing itself, although occasionally find it as a feral or escape from cultivation type of situation. Yeah, so it's really bitter. If you take enough of it, it can be emetic. It can make somebody a vomit, or if you cook it down, if you make it into a syrup and cook it down till it's really thick, that can actually be kind of something that can be used to induce vomiting as well. But in a normal strength, it's usually not going to do that. It's just going to taste really bitter, make people make a face, and then it's going to go through their liver, and it's going to stimulate their liver. And probably even the act of tasting the bitter stuff is going to make the liver start producing more digestive juices, more bile. And then when it passes through the liver, it's going to have the same soothing and somewhat stimulating effect that it's going to have on the lungs, helping to remove congestion from the liver, just like it's going to help remove congestion from the chest or the sinuses. So mainly nowadays, people use it as a respiratory herb, but longer ago, people often used it as an antidote to poisoning. And there was a famous case in South Carolina where there was an herbalist who was enslaved and was given his freedom for publishing his herbal formula that he was using to treat poisoning. And horehound was one of the herbs that he used. So it was known. I think let's see, Gerardus Cambrensis, who was author from Britain in medieval times, he wrote about using it as an antidote for poison as well. And probably what it's doing there is causing the liver to metabolize things faster. It's probably making the liver produce more enzymes, which break down poisonous substances more quickly. It may also be causing them to pass through the digestive system faster by the fact that bile is going into the digestive system and kind of rushing everything along, which would keep you from absorbing poison if you were eating something poisonous. But horehound also has a history of use for envenomation and bites, including snake bites and dog bites. And that might be where the hound part comes into the name. I'm not really sure. But for that purpose, it's crushed up and used as a poultice. I have never used it for that because I don't see a lot of that sort of thing. And when I do see it, I treat it through basically hygiene and supportive care and anti-inflammatories. And it may just be that it has some anti-inflammatory effect, and that's the main thing that people are seeing. But when you read what people have written about it in the past, they do talk about using it for rattlesnake bites, crushing up the juice and having someone take that internally, and also applying it as a poultice for, deadly snake bites, for bites from allegedly rabid dogs and things like that. So it does it has at least been claimed to have a pretty dramatic ability to keep foreign substances from being introduced into the body and doing destructive things. Like I said, I'm not vouching for its ability to do that, because I have not really, that's not what I have done in situations where I've treated bites, and I haven't treated snake bite. Well, I haven't treated rattlesnake bites before, so I'm not sure what does or doesn't work other than not getting bit by a rattlesnake, which is my favorite approach to that situation. Don't pick them up and pass them around at church, that sort of thing. They don't really like to bite people. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, with the question about the types of horehound. So when I'm talking about horehound, I'm just talking about marubium, which is what I would call the real horehound, and the other things are kind of called different types of horehound because they're similar flavors or whatever. But yeah, marubium is the type that I'm talking about here, and there are probably a lot of cultivated varieties, but they're all the same species. And then Balota is called black horehound. I haven't actually seen Lycopus called horehound before. I always call it bugle or something like that. But anyway, yeah, it's marubium is the plant that I'm talking about in this case when I'm talking about horehound. So again, that's one you're not likely to be able to go out and find in the wild, but it is something that seeds are probably pretty readily available for from seed catalogs and things like that. I've seen it for sale at Home Depot. You know, it's a pretty common garden plant. If you are going to grow it, and this goes for pretty much any mint, I would say grow it in a container, grow it in a bucket, because mints can kind of spread out. Horehound is much less inclined to do that than some other mints, but it's capable of it. It can spread by seeds, and it can spread by roots, runners. So it's something you don't want to introduce into the environment, have it become invasive. Although, you know, like I said, it tends not to, but just in general with any kind of mint, I think it's good to grow it in a container, a big planter or a bucket or something like that with some soil in it in full sun. They're easy enough to grow. They're weed-like in their growth tendencies. And so that's you know, it's if you want to grow a medicinal plant, it's a reasonable one to grow. It's not difficult. Doesn't really require any special skills or anything, and it will produce for years and years a lot of the time. You know, can kind of just kind of keep growing once it's gotten established in the same spot, especially if that's a container that you can move around if you don't like where it's at. So if you grow it, you can harvest it probably 3 or 4 times during a season. You can come out and trim it real low to the ground, and it'll just grow right back up. And you can do that a few times. A lot of the time, people have used the roots of it, especially in former times when the roots are easier to store. They contain the same bitter stuff. I always just use the above ground parts because I find it easier to harvest and kind of less hassle as far as cleaning it up and that sort of thing goes. And if you want to make horehound candy, The way I like to do that is to make a really strong decoction of the horehound and then add sugar to it and then cook it until the water is almost gone and until the sugar has been heated to a high enough temperature that it forms really large bubbles, and then pour that out into, nowadays I use candy molds that are like little, you can buy them at craft stores like Michael's, and they're silicone molds. I have heart-shaped ones. You can pour the candy in it and then you can pop it out and you get a little piece of hard candy that shape. Before I had that, I would get a skillet of not shredded, well, just finely crushed ice, or snow if you get snow from outside, if you live in a place where you can do that, and just make little spoon shaped indentations in that and pour the molasses, I mean the cooked sugar syrup into that and let it harden, and then roll it in powdered sugar so that it doesn't, so that they don't stick to each other. And that's another way of making it. The silicone molds are easier though. So that's a way that you can make the horehound candy, and that's probably would be another good recipe for it. You want to use about 3 ounces of horehound to 2 quarts of water, and then add 4 cups of sugar and reduce that until it's a thick syrupy substance that's ready to be made into candy. But yeah, that's a traditional both treat and medicine around here. You know, it's kind of one of those things. It's a matter of personal taste, and some people really like them and some people think they're really gross. They do have a very vegetable-y taste to them though, so if you're not used to candy that tastes like vegetables, it's going to strike you as pretty weird. But I don't know, I find it pretty interesting. It would be, you know, if somebody wanted to be creative for maybe a project or something like that, trying that with some other mints or other aromatic herbs might be an interesting thing to try out. Especially since there are so many people with persistent coughs these days and persistent shortness of breath and stuff like that, and in our world where lots of people are experiencing post-COVID effects. And let's see. Yeah. So in terms of supporting the liver, horehound is quite a bit more bitter than burdock. It is kind of different in terms of what it does. It's more specific. I would say that burdock is just kind of a very general food / remedy for the liver that works over time, whereas horehound is stronger and is going to work faster, but it's most especially going to work for situations where the liver is congested or swollen and there's not a lot of movement of the fluid from the liver. So that's something that would be more helpful if somebody had, for instance, you know, just gone through a phase of binge drinking and you were trying to get their liver to go back to normal, or if somebody had gotten a waterborne infection like giardia or something like that, or if they'd had mono or something of that nature where their liver had been under a lot of strain from a sickness. Horehound is really good for helping it to go back to normal when it hasn't been out of phase for very long, when it's been, you know, not a long-term disruption. If it's a longer-term disruption, then sometimes gentler remedies over more time are more helpful than more stimulating remedies for a short amount of time. All right, so great question. Where is yellow dock in the strength level as far as all this goes? Yellow dock is a very simple bitter. So it doesn't have a lot of aromatic anything to it. It's bitter. It does have some anti-inflammatory properties along with that, but the taste is pretty much purely bitter. It is much stronger than burdock. It's not as bitter as horehound, but it is more stimulating to the flow of bile than horehound is. So horehound more like breaks up congestion in the liver, helps stuck fluids to get started moving. Yellow dock induces the liver to produce more fluids. So it would be exactly the wrong thing to use in somebody who had a badly congested liver, like what I just described, because it would probably just make their liver swell more as it produced more fluids that weren't going anywhere, and that would probably cause pain. But if somebody's liver is not congested like that and you want to strongly stimulate it, it's not a super powerful stimulator of the liver, but it is a medium strength one. It's pretty bitter. I use it a lot for people with skin issues. Sometimes strengthening the liver can help with skin issues. And so it's kind of something that is particularly good for that, or appears to be particularly good for that. And it also helps with digestion too. So yeah, I would say that it's much stronger than burdock, on a similar level of strength, but quite different in its action from horehound, and not as strong as something like aloe latex or some other herbs that we haven't talked about that are strongly bitter. Gentian, for instance, would be, or the Culver's root, which I mentioned earlier, which would be, dramatically strong stimulators of the liver. So it's not on that level, but it's on it's kind of medium strength, medium to strong, but not super strong. Could horehound help the liver after intentional exposure to certain poisonous ceremonial medicines, such as combo, even after years later from the exposure? If there appeared to be something like that you would attribute to that, like if the liver started having problems around that time, there's a good chance that it would be helpful for that. Short term after that, it would definitely be a very appropriate remedy to use after any kind of poisoning, intentional or unintentional or whatever. It's a pretty good thing to use. Often in that sort of situation, I might use it along with St. John's wort, which helps to process. It helps to speed up the production of certain enzymes in the liver, which speed up the breakdown of certain substances in the body, certain toxins, drugs, things like that, hormones. So yeah, often I might use horehound and St. John's wort together in that kind of situation, depending on what the presenting symptoms were, depending on what kind of things the person was experiencing as a result of it. So hope that is some kind of answer to that question. Oh, not what I meant to do. Let's see. All right, so the liver is one of the more complicated organs. It's the first organ that I've talked about specifically in this kind of depth, but in this course, but it is a very complicated organ, and it plays a role in a lot of different systems in the body. And because of that, it's sort of like the place where a lot of different systems meet, sort of an intersection or a crossing of ways of a lot of different systems. And so that's probably why it's the organ that got named liver, even though they're all living. And it is why I think it's a really important organ to start looking at fairly early on in the process of learning about how herbs interact with human physiology. Uh, so, so yeah, you've given some examples of how some herbs interact with it. Um, bitters generally are going to have an effect on the liver, and there are a lot of herbal bitters out there, a lot of herbal formulas, and a lot of specific herbs that are bitter. One that we saw this weekend was golden seal. Golden seal is a very bitter herb. It's yellow, which is also a color that's kind of been associated with the liver, since if somebody's liver is having trouble, they often have an accumulation of yellow pigment. So golden seal would be an example of a pretty strong herb for the liver. It's not only for the liver. Most of the time when people are using golden seal, they're using it for other reasons, like the fact that it's drying, or the fact when people have congestion, for instance, they use it as a drying herb. If somebody has infection, it can be used topically to fight infection, sometimes internally as well, depending on where the infection is in the body. And it also stimulates the kidneys. It's a diuretic as well. So that's another thing that it's been used for. But people also use golden seal to try and cleanse the body, to try and purify the blood, maybe get drugs out of their system, and so forth. And so that's an example of a pretty commonly used herb, a pretty widely known herb that is also a strong liver thing. Yeah, so question here about Crazy Owl, who was an herbalist who lived around here for a while, using gravel root bark. And gravel root bark is Eutrochium, also known as Queen of the Meadow or Joe Pye weed. There are multiple different species of it, but the most common one, I think, is just called Eutrochium purpureum, and it's Queen of the Meadow or gravel root, and it's a very tall, 10 or 12 foot tall plant with purplish pink flowers, and the root stimulates the production of bile, especially, and so it's been used for getting rid of gallstones, flushing out the gallbladder, and the gallbladder holds fluids that are produced from the liver and releases them into the digestive system, and there can be stones or gravel that accumulates there, and gravel root tends to dilate those bile ducts and cause production of bile and wash the gravel or the stones out. Somebody gets blocked bile ducts, then you get sort of like a gallbladder attack, cholecystitis, which is just usually abdominal pain with a lot of vomiting. And that can be a really troublesome situation that's often dealt with surgically. But gravel root is a traditional remedy that's also used in that situation. There are also a lot of fake liver cleanses out there, fake gallbladder cleanses. Some of them involving like taking a lot of olive oil and a lot of some sort of acid like lemon juice or vinegar, and then the idea is, or the kind of one interpretation of what's going on is that people, when they have a bowel movement, they pass a lot of these little round balls, but you can actually make the little round balls happen just by combining the substances together and shaking them up in a jar. And it's just like emulsifications of the olive oil and the other stuff. And it's not necessarily actually coming out of your gallbladder. So that's something that is maybe started out as a misinterpretation, but it's been pretty widely demonstrated for decades now that that's not actually just a bunch of gallstones coming out of you, because sometimes the amount of gallstones is far in excess of what a person's body could actually have space for. So, there are a lot of liver cleanses out there, and a lot of sort of one size fits all cure all remedies that are based around the idea of liver cleansing. And liver cleansing is really versatile. Stimulating the liver, getting the liver to work is a really versatile treatment that will work for a lot of things, but it also does kind of lend itself towards the sort of unfortunate situation where people are using one treatment for everything instead of looking individually at what's going on with a particular person's body and what their body might need under those circumstances. How to feel about artichoke for liver care. Artichoke is a really nice, gentle herb for the liver. It's very similar to milk thistle or blessed thistle. It's another kind of thistle, and it's protective to the liver. It will help protect the liver from stuff that it comes in contact with at the same time, or if you've recently gotten food poisoning, for instance, and you wanted to take some artichoke to help protect your liver from the poisons that are being produced, then that's a really useful thing. Or if you've had to be on a round of anesthesia or something like that, and you want to do something to help your liver out, can be a really good thing for that. The other thing that I should mention while talking about the liver that I haven't really gotten into at all is that you do have to be careful with working on the liver if somebody is taking medications, if somebody's relying on some other form of medications or treatments, because it is possible to stimulate the liver in such a way that it depletes those substances from the body, because it doesn't really necessarily, know that you're taking Depakote to control seizures. It's just like, okay, here's a foreign substance. Let's metabolize it. Let's break it down. And might keep it from working. In the case of St. John's wort, it will keep a lot of prescription drugs from doing what they're supposed to do. In the case of other things, it might deplete the amount of them in the system in such a way that it will not have its full therapeutic effect. And so, anytime you're taking something that's like an antidote to poisons or a cleansing thing for your body, you have to remember that there might be certain foreign substances or even toxic substances that you wanted to be in there, and not to purge them unduly. So, something like burdock, I really am not worried about it very much. With milk thistle and artichoke, I'm really not either. Those are basically foods. Those are, really mild. It's not to say that they couldn't have any effect over the long term, but they're not going to have a sudden and dramatic effect that a person who's paying attention would not be able to intercept in time and do something about. So that's something to be aware of if you're working with someone's liver or your own liver. Is are they relying on some sort of medicine that is metabolized through the liver? Not all medicines are. Or are they not? Because that can make a difference in which types of remedies might be appropriate. All right. Any questions about any of that? How might you work with burdock seed? I don't really use burdock seed very much. When I've tasted it, it tastes kind of like the less bitter and more aromatic parts of the root. So I think that if I wanted something that was similar but not bitter, I might use that. Although in real life, I would probably use caraway because I'm more used to it. But the seeds do have some of the same medicinal substances as the roots, but not all of them. I would probably try and find someone who had used it, or find some culture who had been used to using it for a while, and see what they do with it before I try to do anything other than scatter it and let it grow. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the first project, the plant collecting project. hopefully people are working on this. I don't know. I talked a little bit. We talked a little bit about it on the walk also. But yeah, I think that if you're not working on it, it's a good time to start. If you are working on it, you know, if you're pressing plants, you probably want to leave them pressed for 4 days to a week before you take them out and mount them, which is just, I like to use rubber cement for that because it doesn't contain any water. Put a little bit of that on the back of them and put them on a piece of paper. But for each plant, I want to make sure that you have not only the common name or a common name for it, but also the Latin name, the two-part Latin binomial, and some information about where you collected it and what you know about the plant, what you might use the plant for, or for instance, you could look it up and say that, you know, some particular author makes some particular statement about it, that sort of thing. I just want to encourage anybody who is working on this and wants any help to reach out to me directly, either in text or email or whatever, and make sure that we can, you know, have you working on this in a way that works for you. You know, if you're not doing the pressing plants and you're just taking a picture and putting that in a document electronically, that's fine too. I've been kind of redoing one with that process. I haven't done this process in a while, so and when I did do it, I did do the pressing flowers and mounting them. But right now I'm just taking, because I take a lot of pictures for Instagram and things like that anyway, just doing it that way. And I like that process too. But yeah, I just want to make sure that everybody knows that if they need some guidance with that process, that I'm very much here for it, and encourage everybody to work on that. All right, so does anybody have any questions about that process? Okay. Well, hopefully it's not too daunting. I know that it can be kind of a big undertaking or whatever, but I'd like to see everybody have at least 50 plants in theirs, and I feel like that shouldn't be too much to come up with if you get the time to devote towards it. But I do know that it is an expenditure of time, and I've had a few people reach out to me this month saying that they were, you know, not really able to keep up with the time commitment of this course, which is you know, kind of sad, because I realize that that's something that that everybody probably has to, you know, it's a lot to work into your schedule or whatever. But I really appreciate the people who are sticking with it and who are committed to it enough to go through with it. So thanks for being here, and I just want you to know that I'm here to help if you run into any specific problems with any of that. Well, if nobody has any questions about it, I guess that's about all I have for today. All right. Well, let's see how best to. Photographs and plant information. Email is good. Yeah. Yeah, email is probably the easiest way to do it. So you can send an attachment or whatever. I can receive some things through text as well. if it's just photographs, I can look at those through texts. It's more like documents or something like that, then email would be better. Yeah, thanks for taking the initiative to join the class. I really appreciate it, and I really feel like it's a good thing to have in the community, good thing to have in the world, some more accessible and slightly differently oriented plant medicine education. So, all right, well, thanks for coming, everybody. And if you think of any questions, feel free to message me.
Hey, Andrew.
Yeah.
Sorry, as you're saying goodbye, I just walked in from karate, so I wasn't able to talk. I just wanted to clarify the plant study really quick. So 50 plants in the book, name, scientific name, and something medicinal properties about them, essentially.
Yes.
Is that it?
Yeah, that's the idea.
Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. All right. Well, I will talk to you all soon, and hopefully get a chance to watch the video that I recently posted, and I will be posting this one hopefully on Thursday. That's my plan, is to get it posted by Thursday evening. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Night.